Welcome to History at the OK Corral. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, share this episode with a fellow history lover, and leave us a comment down below. And now, on to tonight's episode. July 27th, 1816. On the Apalachicola River, in the panhandle of Spanish Florida, stands Fort Negro, a former British-held enclave during the War of 1812 that is now inhabited by nearly 400 escaped slaves and their Choctaw allies. The ex-slaves, now known as Maroons, are making a desperate stand against an expeditionary force of several hundred American soldiers, Coweta and Creek warriors, and a devastating fleet of American gunboats. Under the command of Garçon, a 30-year-old carpenter who had fled from his life of forced servitude in Spanish-held Pensacola, the Maroons and the Choctaw have made a death pact. They would accept nor offer any quarter, knowing that surrender would at best be a means to return to bondage and their, quote, slave owners. They were determined to fight to the last man. After several days of intense combat, several instances of intense hand-to-hand fighting had taken place. Yet, more broadly, the battle was an encounter of artillery, with the gunners inside the fortification launching cannonballs, grape shot, and mortars towards the American forces. However, they did so with little efficacy. The U.S. gunboats achieved moderate success, but no clear advantage had been gained. This day's long stalemate had the American officers considering their options of either starving out the Maroons or ordering a far more costly assault on the fort with infantry and Coweta warriors. However, everything would change in an instant. As the U.S. gunboat 154 began heating their cannonballs in a makeshift furnace, one of the fiery hot projectiles was sent out in a volley that would end the battle at once. It cleared the high walls of the fort and landed directly in the armory. This set off a thunderous explosion that could be heard for over 100 miles. Dozens of bodies and limbs could be seen flying through the air. Men, women, and children alike, many of which had been set on fire. The American soldiers could scarcely celebrate the dramatic conclusion of the bloody affair as the humanity of the macabre scene overtook them. It has been known as the single deadliest shot in American history. More than 250 people died instantly. The U.S. executed Garçon, who had survived the blast, and then withdrew from Spanish Florida. News of the catastrophic battle quickly spread through American, Spanish, and native territories. Neamathla, the mighty Seminole leader, was furious at the destruction of the fort, and sent word to General Gaines that should his soldiers be found to have crossed the Flint River, they would face brutal attacks by the Seminole warriors. This would set in motion a series of violent escalations that came to be known as the First Seminole War, a conflict that would grip the Florida region for nearly 4 decades. Fowltown was a village that had belonged to the Miccosukee Creek people, located in southwestern Georgia, just 15 miles east of Fort Scott. Chief Neamathla had already been angered by the U.S. reoccupation of Fort Scott in June of 1817. Captain Sanders Donahoe had arrived from Charleston in mid-June, and he would be reinforced by Major David E. Twiggs just a month later, arriving with his company of the 7th U.S. Infantry. The men had made an overland march from Fort Crawford in present-day East Bruton, Alabama. Their heavy supplies were shipped on the water by way of Mobile. The movement of the U.S. troops was observed with great interest by the collective chiefs that had inhabited the surrounding area. While many men were unhappy with the encroachment of the Americans, one in particular, William Perryman, of the Lower Creeks, welcomed their arrival. Perryman harbored resentment towards the Red Sticks over the fact that his brother had suffered when the fort had been burned by Tutolosis earlier that year. Perryman asked Twiggs to hold a council so that the chiefs could express their support for the United States. Major Twiggs would learn of Perryman's true motives just after the council had been held on August 4th and express his new understanding as such. Quote, "The objects of the chiefs and warriors who attended that meeting was to have a talk with the commanding officer, for the purpose of expressing their friendship to the United States and their intention of remaining at peace with the United States. I understand from another source, which at the time I deemed to be conclusive evidence of the fact that one object of the chiefs and warriors who attended the meeting had in view was to flog in my presence the chief of Fowltown, Neamathla, for his permitting his warriors to commit depredations on the inhabitants of the Georgia frontier, and afterwards stating those outrages committed by his own people to have been committed by the people of their own towns. Twiggs was surprised to be used as a vehicle for political posturing amongst tribal chiefs, but the move by Perryman was an astute, if not also dangerous one, as he so openly attempted to draw himself into the graces of the Americans. By so openly moving against Neamathla, he risked drawing himself into the Seminole leader's crosshairs. Twiggs would also discover that Perryman was not alone in his desire to admonish the Seminole, as Neamathla had also upset the first and second chiefs of Ekanachate, Ochisitalofa, and Choconicla. The meeting was delayed until 4 in the afternoon, but Neamathla would not show up for the council, blunting Perryman's desire to publicly reprimand him. Major General Edmund Gaines was reassured by the attending chiefs of a desire to live in peace with the Americans, but the tribal leaders stated they did not believe the towns of natives to the east of Flint and Apalachicola rivers felt the same. This included Neamathla's Fowltown. Gaines demanded that Miccosukee surrender the warriors responsible for killing white settlers along the St. Mary's River. Major Twiggs responded to Gaines, tempering the expectations for cooperation, quote, "I have not heard a word from the Seminoles that can be relied upon, but in my opinion, they will never give up a murderer to the whites. In fact, the chief of Fowltown, who is frequently among the Seminoles, told me 8 days ago that the Flint River was the line between us, and I must not cut a single stick of timber on the opposite side." General Gaines had reached the same conclusion as Twiggs, that conflict with Neamathla was inevitable, but he would make one final demand for the surrender of the warriors responsible for the killings. Capachamico said he would respond within 10 days, and the message he would end up conveying addressed the changes that had occurred in the prior years, with their cattle being driven off by the whites, 3 natives having been killed, and the displacement to their side of the river. As it pertained to the Americans' desire to capture escaped slaves, he would state, "We have nothing to do with them. They were put here by the English, and to them you ought to apply to anything about them. We do not wish our country desolated by an army passing through it for the concern of other people. The Indians have slaves here also, a great many of them. When we have an opportunity, we shall apply to the English for them, but we cannot get them now." The chief was referring to the, quote, "freedom papers" given to any slave that was willing to take up arms on behalf of the British during the War of 1812. Major General Gaines would forward this response to Major General Andrew Jackson at the end of September 1817. Gaines would send a second letter to Jackson on October 1st, as well as one almost identical to it that he forwarded to the Secretary of War, explaining in detail that no other recourse besides the use of force remained. However, Gaines still requested that a survey of lands be conducted to distinguish borders of the territories that had been ceded to the Treaty of Fort Jackson that ended the Creek War in 1814. The Secretary of War authorized Gaines to remove natives from lands now claimed by the United States, so long as they did not cross into the Spanish-held territory. General Gaines and his columns of soldiers from the 4th and 7th Infantry crossed from Fort Crawford to Fort Gaines upon a military road cut by Major Twiggs. From there, they carried on to Fort Scott. They arrived at Fort Scott on November 18th. The first task upon arrival was to send a runner to Fowltown to request that Neamathla come to the post and meet with Gaines. But based upon the wording of the demand, Neamathla was left with only 2 real options: surrender or fight. Should he and his people attempt to flee, they would still be designated as enemies of the state. After Neamathla refused to surrender, Major Twiggs put together a battalion of 250 men and then set out for Fowltown on November 20th. Gaines told Twiggs not to fire upon women and children should the inevitable skirmishing occur. Twiggs and his men would cross the Flint River by boat and canoe, then turn back to the east to arrive at Fowltown just before dawn. Captain Hugh Young, an Army topographer, had written a description of Fowltown that curated accounts from several officers who had visited. Quote, Fowltown, the last settlement of these Indians, was 12 miles east of Fort Scott, in a tolerable body of land. They had between 30 and 40 warriors, and their chief, Neamathla, was a man of talents and courage, although, in character, they were perfidious, cowardly, and mischievous. Neamathla had not been expecting any attack to come from the U.S. troops, and no warriors had been placed to defend the settlement from a surprise incursion. Thus, Twiggs had approached Fowltown completely undetected. Once the presence of the Americans had been discovered, the natives fired upon their lines. The soldiers returned fire, launching a single, lethal volley into the village. 4 Seminole warriors and a Seminole woman were killed in the opening exchange. Observing that he had been taken by complete surprise and was outmanned and outgunned, Neamathla quickly ordered the evacuation of all his people from Fowltown to a nearby swamp. Twiggs returned to Fort Scott with his battalion just after daybreak. The town was not razed, but rather left intact. A letter to Neamathla from the British was found in his home. The certificate read that he, quote, had always been a true and faithful friend of the British. General Gaines would send Lieutenant Colonel Matthew Arbuckle and a large contingent of men back to the town just 2 days later. The men of Arbuckle's 7th Infantry would approach the town from a different direction. This time, as the Americans made their approach, signal guns were fired into the sky as Seminole scouts had discovered the approaching men's flanking parties. Upon arriving at the town, they found it deserted, yet they could hear whoops and yells coming from the swampland that surrounded the settlement to the northeast. The Seminole corn reserves were being loaded into wagons by the troops when an assault was launched by the natives. The surprise attack was recounted by the Americans. Quote, the loading of the wagons was done when the Indians, 50 or 60 in number, were perceived advancing by the sentinels posted in the swamp and fired on. The fire was instantly returned by the Indians who, giving the war whoop, advanced rapidly towards our lines. Parties were immediately detached to take possession of the houses between our position and the swamp. A spirited fire was then kept up for 20 or 25 minutes when the Indians returned into the swamp. The native warriors could be seen traversing the open ground during the attack, and no less than 8 were observed killed, while several more were gravely wounded. Arbuckle was surprised by the intensity of the attack, in particular that the natives faced odds of no less than 6 to 1. But the American lieutenant colonel failed to understand how vital the corn reserves were to the people of Fowltown in surviving the coming winter. The Americans retreated from the town, and Neamathla and his warriors fled deeper into the swamp. The U.S. troops marched north to Burgess Bluff and buried their lone casualty, a musician named Aaron Hughes. There, they began construction on a new fort. Arbuckle would name it Fort Hughes, after the fallen soldier. The U.S. Army raids directed at Fowltown were objective failures. They did not succeed in removing the inhabitants from the lands ceded in the Treaty of Fort Jackson or in capturing Neamathla. What the expeditions did succeed in doing was unifying the Lower Creek, Seminoles, Black Seminoles, Red Sticks, and Miccosukee together in anger at this aggression from the Americans. The natives' reprisal to the U.S. Army's Fowltown overture would be one of the most horrific massacres ever carried out upon American citizens in the barbarous history of the American and Native affairs. But that grisly tale, and the many battles to come in the bloody and enduring Seminole Wars, are, for tonight, other stories for other times. Thank you for joining us on this episode of History at the OK Corral. Be sure to click the like button, share this episode with a friend, and become a subscriber. Also, if you'd like to support our work and gain early access to episodes, as well as ad-free viewing, you can become a member of this channel by clicking on the Join button below, or click the link in the description below to become a member on Patreon. Thank you again for watching, and we'll see you next time on History at the OK Corral, home of history's greatest shootouts and showdowns.